Mark Zuckerberg had just finished a long day of meetings in a small city deep in Europe. Sitting in the car, taking him back to the hotel, he could clearly feel the fatigue creeping in. The back-to-back meetings, the long presentations, and the sharp questions from his partners had drained his energy. Drowsiness crept up on him, but he quickly brushed it aside. Mark had never been one to waste time on hasty naps between business trips. He knew he needed another way to relieve stress, to clear his mind after a day of heavy work. The car stopped in front of an ancient building. He got out, took a deep breath, and looked around. This city, although not where he planned to stay long-term, still made him feel something special. The narrow streets and the undulating tiled-roofed buildings, like classical paintings, seemed to be preserving all traces of time. The light from the yellow street lamps lingered in the air, creating an unusually peaceful and quiet atmosphere. The scene reminded Mark of the cool evenings back home and the walks in Palo Alto when he was a student. The streets were full of trees, with fresh air and little noise. Although his career had taken him everywhere, sometimes he still longed for the peaceful feeling of small streets. He had no particular purpose when he went out. He just wanted to relax, to clear his mind a bit before returning to bigger plans. Mark walked on the cobblestone streets, listening to his footsteps echo in the night. The whole city seemed to be immersed in silence. Only the gentle wind blowing through the trees on both sides of the road. The smell of damp earth and moldy wood wafted in the air, making him feel as if he was lost in another world, where there were no more worries, only a feeling of pure freedom. Suddenly, Mark's eyes caught a sparkling light at the end of the street. He didn't think much of it, just walked towards it, as a natural reflex. As he got closer, he realized it was a small restaurant with a shiny sign. This restaurant stood out among the old houses, where most of them were closed shops or had windows that were only slightly open. The restaurant sign was a light brown wooden board with the words "Mother's Rice" written in both Vietnamese and English. The soft handwriting on the black wooden background made him feel like he was seeing a part of Vietnam, a country he had never visited, but had heard a lot about through friends, colleagues, and stories online. Inside the restaurant, warm yellow light radiated from the lanterns hanging high on the ceiling, reflecting on the old wooden tables, creating a rustic but cozy space. A gentle, intimate feeling spread from this restaurant that made him unable to step in. It was not the urge of curiosity, but a peaceful feeling, as if he was finding something familiar in this strange space. Mark could not explain the reason clearly, but he felt as if he had found a small house in the heart of this strange city. Mark stepped into the restaurant, and the wooden door creaked slightly when he pushed it open. The space inside was cozy, with warm, yellow lights from the lanterns hanging from the ceiling, creating a strangely familiar feeling. Inside, there was no noisy sound of a crowded restaurant, only the gentle silence of a small restaurant, where every corner bore the mark of family. Mrs. Lan, the owner, was standing near the kitchen, busy clearing away the dishes, but when she heard the creaking sound of the door, she looked up. At first, she thought it was just an ordinary customer, but when her eyes stopped on Mark's face, she froze. She blinked slightly as if she couldn't believe her eyes. The feeling of surprise made her stop for a moment. Then she quickly turned to call her husband. "Min, look, is it Mark Zuckerberg?" Mrs. Lan asked, her voice filled with surprise. Mr. Minnow, who was preparing a bowl of pho for another customer, turned around immediately. Seeing Mark standing there, he was equally surprised. Although he was not a regular news follower, Mark's face was familiar to him from photos and articles about famous businessmen. It only took Mr. Minga few seconds to recognize him, and he immediately stood up and walked quickly toward Mark. "Oh my God, you're Mark Zuckerberg, right?" "So Mr. Minna asked, his voice stuttering in surprise. Mark smiled and nodded slightly. "Yes, I'm Mark." Yes. Both husband and wife stood still, looking at each other and then back at Mark, unable to hide their surprise. To them, Mark Zuckerberg was such a big name, an icon of the technology world that they never thought they would meet in real life. Mrs. Lan couldn't hide her surprised smile, mixed with a bit of worry. As for Mr. Minnow, after a moment of confusion, he regained his composure and hurriedly invited Mark to sit down. You came to our little shop? What an honor. I didn't expect to meet someone like you here." "So Mr. Min said, while his eyes couldn't leave Mark's face, as if trying to perceive his presence. Mark smiled, feeling comfortable seeing the enthusiasm of Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan. He nodded, smiling, and replied, "I happened to be walking by here and found the restaurant very special. It's a surprise to meet you guys here." Yes. Mrs. Lan, although a bit shy, still approached Mark, bowed politely, and asked, "Do you want to try anything special? All the dishes here are traditional family dishes, very simple but rich in Vietnamese flavor." Yes. Mark looked at Mrs. Lan, feeling warm in his heart at their hospitality. "Thank you very much. I want to try the grilled pork ribs with broken rice. It sounds delicious." Yes. Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan looked at each other and then laughed happily. They couldn't believe that they could serve a famous guest like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, one of the richest and most powerful people in the world. But instead of surprise or worry, joy and hospitality were the most prominent things in their eyes. They decided not to let the surprise stop them, but continued to serve this special guest with all the sincerity and dedication they had always done for other customers. Of course, our grilled pork ribs and broken rice is a special dish. You won't be disappointed, Mrs. Lan said, her hands quickly leaving the counter to prepare the food. Mark sat down, feeling the warm and cozy atmosphere in this small restaurant. He looked around and saw paintings of beautiful Vietnamese countryside scenes hanging on the walls and simple bamboo baskets placed on wooden shelves, all creating a simple but attentive space. He felt Min and Lan's efforts in preserving the culture of their homeland, even though they had been away from home for a long time. Just a few minutes later, Mrs. Lan brought him an attractive plate of grilled pork ribs and broken rice. The grilled ribs were fragrant, and the outer skin was golden brown, giving off a characteristic sweet aroma. On top, a few thin slices of cucumber and some chopped herbs added beauty and color to the dish. Mark picked up his chopsticks, feeling the weight of each piece of smooth white broken rice under the golden ribs. He tried a piece, closing his eyes to feel the new flavor. Immediately, the sweet aroma of grilled ribs and the sweetness of lightly mixed fish sauce filled his mouth. The combination of the softness of the ribs, the salty sweetness of the fish sauce, and the slight sourness of the cucumber surprised Mark. He felt the sincerity and closeness in each bite, as if this dish was cooked from the freshest ingredients, with the most sincere feelings. Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan stood watching his reaction, smiling gently. Mrs. Lan carefully waited for the special guest's reaction, while Mr. Min stood nearby, his face full of hope. When Mark opened his eyes, they saw his eyes light up, excitement evident on his face. "This is grilled ribs with broken rice, right?" Mark asked, picking up his chopsticks and picking up another piece of ribs, chewing slowly to enjoy the flavor. "Yes, sir, this dish is a specialty of the South. We make it very elaborately to preserve the traditional flavor, Mr. Min replied, his voice proud but gentle. Mark nodded, continuing to enjoy each bite, feeling like he was returning to a faraway place, full of memories even though he had never been there. This feeling reminded him of his old trips when he was a student experiencing different cultures. It was surprising how a simple dish could bring such a sense of familiarity. After tasting the grilled pork ribs and broken rice, he moved on to a bowl of steaming hot pho. The pho was served with a generous amount of tender beef, a clear broth, and a fragrant aroma of herbs. Mark carefully tasted it and was immediately drawn to the rich, delicate flavors. He couldn't help but nod in approval as he saw that the fresh ingredients were perfectly combined, creating a dish where he could feel the care of the cook. Mrs. Lan and Mr. Min stood nearby, listening to his every reaction with hopeful anticipation. When they saw Mark smile and nod in approval, they both smiled at each other. It felt like a comfort that their small restaurant had finally received the recognition they had been waiting for. After tasting a few different dishes, Mark began to have time to chat with Mr. Min and his wife. He asked about the history of the restaurant, about their lives, and why they decided to open this small restaurant. Mr. Minnie and his wife began to talk about their journey from leaving Vietnam many years ago, hoping to find a better life abroad. They have got through many difficulties and challenges, from working many different jobs to settling in this city. We came here trying to build a new life, but things were not as we imagined. We always had a desire to cook Vietnamese dishes for people who love the taste of home. But life here is not easy. We have to struggle to compete with bigger, more famous restaurants, and especially lack experience in marketing or promoting our restaurant. So Mr. Min said, his eyes a bit sad, but not losing his determination. Mrs. Lan continued, we only have delicious traditional dishes and affection for customers, but it is difficult to attract many people here. Everything is so foreign to us. Unlike those big stores, which have the money to hire media experts and strong promotion teams, we only have the quality of the food and our sincere hearts. Mark listened carefully, feeling the sincerity in their every word. He could feel the tiredness, but not discouragement, in Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan's eyes. They had put all their efforts into this restaurant, hoping that their sincerity would be rewarded. He understood that even if life could be difficult, what he and his wife did was still precious and worthy of respect. I can see the passion you two have for this job, and Mark said, his tone sincere. The quality of the food here is great, and I feel so lucky to have enjoyed it. I think everyone will feel the specialness of this place if they have the chance. Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan looked at each other, a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Sometimes, sincere words of encouragement from a stranger can be more powerful than they think. Mark continued, maybe we need a little more online presence or something to make this restaurant more known. I can help if necessary. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Lan and Mr. Min looked at each other, their eyes exchanging discreetly as if making an important decision. Feeling the sincerity in Mark's words, they still couldn't immediately grasp the opportunity he presented. Doubt still lingered in their hearts, although they were touched by Mark's willingness to help. In the end, they couldn't ignore the fact that maintaining this small restaurant was already too much of a challenge for them. Mrs. Lan spoke slowly, her voice soft but determined. Thank you very much, Mark. We really appreciate your help, but we think maybe this is not the path for us. We have tried very hard, but the number of customers is still not enough. This restaurant, with its traditional dishes, may not suit everyone's taste here. We will only be open until the end of this week. Mr. Min sat silently, his eyes a little sad. But the determination in Mrs. Lan's words made it impossible for him to object. Although they really wanted to continue, they knew that sometimes persistence cannot always change reality. Mark looked at them, feeling a slight sense of loss creeping into his heart. He understood the difficulties they were facing, and although he really wanted to help, he could do little more than listen and encourage them. In the end, he could only nod, accepting their decision. "Of course, I understand," and Mark said, his voice low, but still filled with respect and understanding. "Your decision is very admirable. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, things don't always work out the way we want them to. I just want you to know that your restaurant is very special. The food here is delicious, and your hospitality is something I will always remember." Mrs. Lan bowed her head, grateful for Mark's sincere words. "Thank you, Mark. You made us feel very warm. Although this decision was not easy, we thought it might be time for us to find another path." Mr. Min stood up, approached Mark, and shook his hand with a firm but emotional gaze. "Thank you for coming and sharing your words of encouragement. Regardless, we are very grateful for the opportunity to meet you." Mark smiled and shook Mr. Min's hand. He looked at the couple, feeling their sincerity and open hearts. The space became silent. Only the gentle rustling of dishes and chopsticks in the restaurant remained. Although there was no specific help, he felt that this meeting had brought more value than he had expected. Mark stood up, his eyes still warm as he looked at them. "I believe you will find another way. After all, this is a special restaurant, and what you have done for the customers, for the community, will never be forgotten." Mrs. Lan and Mr. Min stood silently, but in their eyes there was something both regretful and grateful. They saw Mark at the door, where the warm yellow light from the restaurant spread out, creating a space full of affection and warmth. "I wish you all the best," Mrs. Lan said softly. Mark looked at them one last time, smiling kindly. "I wish you both all the best. Thank you for sharing your story with me." As Mark walked out of the restaurant, the warm feeling from the sincerity of Min and Lan still lingered in his heart, although he could not help them in the way he wanted. He knew that the memories of this small restaurant would forever remain in his heart, and in some corners of the city, their story would continue to be told with the rich flavors and open hearts of a Vietnamese family living abroad. After returning to the hotel, Mark Zuckerberg still could not forget the warm feeling that the small restaurant brought. The images of Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan, with their hospitality and sincerity, still appeared clearly in his mind. The feeling of a simple but emotional meal, dishes with rich flavors of the homeland, was like a reminder of the simple but equally precious values in life. Mark looked back at the photos of the food and the restaurant space that he had taken before leaving. The photos of the golden grilled pork rib, the steaming bowl of pho, and the cozy moments he had witnessed in the restaurant. He decided to share his story with his friends on social media, not only about a delicious meal, but also about an inspiring journey of people far from home, who are devoted to preserving the flavors of their homeland in a strange city. In the post, Mark wrote, "Today, I enjoyed a special meal at a small restaurant full of the flavors of my homeland, Vietnam. Mrs. Lan and Mr. Min brought me an experience that was not only great food, but also the sincere hearts of the restaurant owners who love their jobs and customers. In this restaurant, although small, each dish contains love and care in every detail. Thank you for giving me a great meal. If you have the opportunity to visit this area, don't forget to visit Mother's Rice and try authentic traditional dishes." Accompanying the post were photos of the dishes, with images full of color and warmth. Mark did not expect this post to attract attention so quickly. After just one night, his post received thousands of likes, shares, and comments. His friends and followers on social media were all excited about the beautiful photos and the story of a small restaurant full of love and flavor. The next day, when Mark checked his phone notifications, he noticed that Mother's Rice had suddenly become famous. Many of the commenters expressed their curiosity and wanted to try the dishes that Mark loved. The feeling of surprise and joy when witnessing the spread of the story made Mark feel happy. He did not expect that a small action of his could help this restaurant so much. As for Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan, everything seemed like a dream. Their small restaurant, which was previously almost unknown, was now suddenly bustling with customers. Every day, they received calls to reserve tables, and groups of strange customers came just to try the dishes that Mark had introduced. In the first days, they still felt like they could not believe it. Their restaurant began to become more crowded than ever. They could not have imagined that their story would attract so many people, and every time they saw a new customer coming in, they felt a new joy welling up. After the first busy days, Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan felt more and more that their decision was right. Each dish still retained its traditional flavor, still cooked with all sincerity. But now they had new friends and regular customers who loved their food. The number of customers increased, not only because of the unexpected popularity, but also because of the quality of the food and the cozy atmosphere in the restaurant. A week later, when life returned to its normal rhythm, Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan sat together looking around the bustling restaurant. They smiled at each other, their hearts filled with joy. "Do you think we will continue doing this?" Mrs. Lan asked, her eyes shining. "Absolutely, so," Mr. Min replied, holding his wife's hand. "This restaurant has become a part of us, and now it can become a part of this community. People come for the food, but I believe they will come back for the love we have for them. We cannot stop here." Yes. The couple looked at each other, their eyes filled with faith and hope. They decided to continue this journey, despite the difficulties ahead. And thanks to the spread of the story of a small restaurant, they knew that they were no longer alone. The hard days have passed, and now the restaurant Mother's Rice is not just a place to sell rice, but also a part of the community, a place where every customer who enters feels warmth and love. Mark Zuckerberg, although not directly involved in helping, knows that his actions have made a difference. He not only helped a small restaurant become famous, but also helped Mr. Min and Mrs. Lan maintain their faith in the path they had chosen. And in his heart, that was a priceless reward.